August 5, 1942, 10:30 in the morning, Charters Towers Airfield, Queensland, Australia. Major General George Kenny stood beneath the wing of a Douglas A-20 Havoc light bomber, observing a middle-aged captain in oil-stained coveralls fitting machine guns into an aircraft nose in a manner that violated nearly every Army Air Force's regulation imaginable. The captain was Paul Irving Gunn, 42 years old, a former Navy Chief Petty Officer, currently assigned to the 3rd Attack Group. Everyone called him Pappy. The Japanese dominated most of the Southwest Pacific, and American forces were barely clinging to New Guinea. Conventional bombing methods had failed. High-altitude bombing could not hit moving ships. Medium-altitude attacks gave enemy vessels time to maneuver away. American aircraft were being shot down while trying to close the distance enough to score hits. Kenny had arrived in Australia only 3 days earlier to assume command of the 5th Air Force, inheriting a catastrophe: 75 operational fighters for the entire theater, hundreds of wrecked aircraft stacked in salvage yards, demoralized pilots, and tactics that simply did not work. Now he was watching a captain alter an attack bomber without authorization, without engineering clearance, without approval from anyone. Gunn was installing .50 caliber machine guns into the nose of the A-20 where the bombardier normally sat. The weapons came from wrecked P-40 fighters that would never fly again, scavenged personally by Gunn from a pile of 170 destroyed aircraft at the Brisbane salvage yard. He explained his logic to Kenny. At low altitude and high speed, a bombardier could not aim anyway. The pilot would drop bombs and fire guns at the same time, delivering maximum firepower at minimum altitude, skipping bombs into the hulls of ships, strafing decks to suppress anti-aircraft crews, striking targets before they could respond. Kenny listened closely. He understood attack aviation better than most senior officers. He had taught the subject at the Air Corps Tactical School in the 1930s when many dismissed it as inferior to strategic bombing. He had authored developmental requirements for attack aircraft, written instructional material on low-level tactics, experimented with skip bombing against ground targets, and even tested parachute fragmentation bombs. He was one of the few high-ranking officers who believed attack aviation could decide wars. Yet no one had attempted to combine all these elements, attacking ships at wavetop height with modified bombers carrying overwhelming nose-mounted firepower. The idea was radical. If successful, it would transform naval warfare in the Pacific. Ships would become vulnerable to air attack in unprecedented ways. Japanese sea-based reinforcement would be crippled. The strategic balance would change entirely. The concept, however, was completely unauthorized. Army Air Force's regulations required engineering approval for any aircraft modification, approval issued from Wright Field, Ohio, 7,000 miles away. Engineers there tested everything, analyzed stress loads, calculated weight and balance, and verified structural integrity. The process took months, sometimes years. Kenny did not have months. He scarcely had weeks. The Japanese were advancing, American forces were retreating, and innovation could not wait on bureaucracy. Gunn had already lost everything to the Japanese. His wife, Clara, and their 4 children, Nathaniel, Paul Jr., Connie, and Julie, were imprisoned at the University of Santo Tomas internment camp in Manila. Before the war, Gunn had lived in the Philippines, running Philippine Airlines and flying Beechcraft Model 18s between cities. When the Japanese invaded in December 1941, he flew reconnaissance missions, evacuated civilians, and delivered supplies to besieged American forces on Bataan. On April 18, 1942, he flew one of the most perilous missions of his life, piloting an unarmed transport into Japanese-controlled airspace to deliver medical supplies to trapped troops. Japanese fighters intercepted him. Gunn flew at treetop level through jungle terrain, evading enemy aircraft, taking ground fire, and successfully delivering the supplies. He earned the Distinguished Flying Cross, but when American forces surrendered, he was forced to evacuate to Australia. He tried to get his family out first and failed. Manila had already fallen. His wife and children were captured and sent to the internment camp. Gunn escaped, but his family remained behind. He had not seen them since and did not know if they were alive. From that moment forward, he fought the Japanese relentlessly, not through normal channels or procedures, but by whatever methods killed the enemy most efficiently. The first pilot Kenny lost due to inadequate firepower was Captain William Benn. Benn was a B-17 pilot with the 63rd Bomb Squadron, 43rd Bomb Group, a gifted aviator and natural innovator, exactly the kind of officer Kenny needed. In October 1942, Benn developed skip bombing tactics for B-17s attacking Japanese ships, flying at 250 feet and 200 miles per hour, releasing bombs that skipped across the water like stones to strike ships at the waterline where armor was weakest. On October 23, 1942, Benn flew the first successful skip bombing attack, hitting a Japanese cargo ship and watching it sink. The method worked, but B-17s were heavy bombers designed for high-altitude strategic missions, not low-level attack. They lacked forward-firing armament and could not suppress defensive fire during the approach. Crews endured anti-aircraft fire throughout the attack run with no way to fight back. Ben recognized the flaw and worked constantly to overcome it, experimenting with approach angles and release points to reduce exposure time. On January 18, 1943, while leading an attack near La, Ben's aircraft was struck by anti-aircraft fire during the approach and crashed, killing him and his entire crew. Kenny read the casualty report. Ben had followed doctrine, executed the attack flawlessly, but the bomber could not suppress enemy defenses. It was destroyed before releasing its payload. American doctrine insisted bombers fly high and rely on fighter escorts, but Kenny did not have enough fighters. He needed bombers that could defend themselves. The conclusion was unavoidable. American bombers lacked the forward firepower necessary to suppress enemy guns during low-level attacks. High-altitude bombing avoided most anti-aircraft fire but sacrificed accuracy. Medium altitude placed aircraft in the worst possible zone. Low-level attack was the only answer, but it demanded overwhelming forward firepower. Lieutenant Colonel John Davies, commander of the 3rd Attack Group, reported that his pilots were dying because they could not suppress enemy defenses. The .30 caliber guns were useless against armored targets. He needed .50 caliber machine guns capable of penetrating armor, destroying gun positions, and killing crews. Headquarters replied that modifications required engineering approval, which would take 6 months. Davies did not have 6 months. His pilots were dying immediately. That was when Davies told Pappy Gunn to do whatever was necessary. Officially, he could not authorize unauthorized modifications. Unofficially, he could look the other way while his maintenance officer installed scavenged guns from wrecked fighters into aircraft that were supposed to be undergoing routine maintenance. Gunn understood. He had been a Navy enlisted pilot for 20 years. He knew how to work around regulations when lives were at stake. By August 1942, Gunn had modified 6 A-20s with 450 caliber machine guns each. The installation was crude. Sheet metal patches covered blast areas. Ammunition boxes were welded into the nose compartment. Feed systems were jury-rigged from spare parts. Nothing was standardized. Nothing was approved. Everything worked. The modified A-20s flew their first combat mission on August 31, 1942. A coordinated raid with B-26 Marauders against the Japanese airfield at Lele'i, New Guinea. 16 20s participated, 6 of them with guns, nose gun. Modifications. Lieutenant Colonel John Davies led the formation. They flew across the Owen Stanley Mountains at low altitude, following valleys, staying under Japanese radar coverage. The attack began at dawn. The modified A-20s came in at 500-foot altitude, 250 miles per hour airspeed. The Japanese were not expecting low-level attack. Their fighters were parked on the runway. Their anti-aircraft guns were positioned for high-altitude defense. When the A-20s opened fire with their 50 caliber nose guns, the effect was catastrophic. The heavy machine guns destroyed 9 Japanese aircraft on the ground before they could take off. They killed crews running to their fighters. They shredded the control tower. They destroyed fuel trucks. The bombs that followed ignited fires across the airfield. Secondary explosions from ammunition stores and fuel dumps continued for hours after the attack ended. All 16 20s returned to base. One had minor damage from ground fire. No casualties. Davies filed his after-action report the same day. The nose gun modification was a complete success. Forward-firing 50 caliber machine guns suppressed defensive fire so effectively that the bombers could attack at minimum altitude with minimal risk. The tactic should be expanded to all 20s in theater as soon as possible. He recommended that Captain Gunn be promoted and given authority to modify additional aircraft. Kenny read the report and made his decision immediately. He promoted Gunn to major. He assigned him to 5th Air Force Headquarters as Special Projects Officer. He gave him a team of mechanics and armorers. He ordered him to modify every A-20 in the Southwest Pacific theater and to scavenge whatever parts were necessary from the wreck pile. Gunn went to work. Over the next 2 months, Gunn modified 32 A-20 aircraft. He also solved a critical range problem. The standard A-20 had a combat radius of 260 mi with a full bomb load. That was not enough to reach Japanese bases on the north coast of New Guinea. Gun installed. Auxiliary fuel tanks in the bomb bay, reducing bomb capacity but extending range to 400 m. The modification required custom fabricated tanks, modified fuel systems, and careful weight and balance calculations. Gun did it all without engineering drawings or official approval. But the A-20 still had limitations. It was a light bomber, designed for tactical support, not strategic attack. It could carry only 2,000 pounds of bombs. Its range, even with auxiliary tanks, was barely adequate. Kenny needed something bigger, something that could reach every Japanese base in New Guinea and the Bismarck archipelago. Something that could carry enough firepower to destroy shipping and devastate installations. He needed the B-25 Mitchell. The B-25 was a medium bomber, twin-engine, crew of 6, designed for medium-altitude bombing. It could carry 3,000 pounds of bombs, had a range of 500 mi, and was fast enough to outrun most Japanese fighters. But it had the same problem as every other American bomber. Inadequate forward armament, just 250 caliber guns in the nose fired by the Bombardier, not enough to suppress enemy defenses. Kenny called Gunn into his office in November 1942. He wanted 12 B-25s modified as strafer bombers. Remove the bombardier. Remove the bomb sight. Fill the nose with as many 50 caliber guns as physically possible. Add external fuel tanks to increase range. Turn the medium bomber into a commerce destroyer that could sink ships, destroy airfields, and eliminate Japanese positions at low altitude with overwhelming firepower. Gunn said it would work, but there would be serious engineering challenges. Adding 4 or more guns to the nose would shift the center of gravity forward by at least 12 inches. The aircraft would be nose-heavy. Handling characteristics would change dramatically. Takeoff would require higher speeds and more runway. Landing would be critical because the nose would want to drop. Pilots would need retraining. There were also structural concerns. 850 caliber machine guns firing simultaneously would produce tremendous recoil forces. The airframe was not designed for that kind of stress. Rivets might pop, panels might buckle, structural members might crack. The modifications would have to include significant reinforcement, adding weight, which would further affect performance. The ammunition load would also be a challenge. 8 guns with 500 rounds each meant 4,000 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition. Each round weighed approximately 4 ounces. 4,000 rounds weighed 1,000 pounds. That weight had to go in the nose, making the center of gravity problem even worse. Fuel would have to be moved aft. Equipment would have to be repositioned. The entire aircraft would have to be rebalanced. And there was one more problem: regulations. The B-25 was built by North American Aviation under contract to the Army Air Force. Any modification to the basic design required approval from both the manufacturer and the Army Air Force Engineering Command. That approval process could take a year or more. Gunn would be modifying aircraft without manufacturer approval, without engineering approval, without documentation, using parts scavenged from other aircraft. If anything went wrong, if a modified aircraft crashed due to structural failure or handling problems, Gunn would face a court-martial. Kenny might face relief from command. Kenny told Gunn to solve the problems and ignore the regulations. They were at war. American pilots were dying because they could not suppress enemy fire. If Gunn's modifications saved lives and killed Japanese, that was all that mattered. Official approval could come later. Results came first. Gunn went to work. He selected B-25 aircraft number 41 to 12,946 for the first conversion. The aircraft had just arrived from the United States and had not yet been assigned to a combat squadron. It was nicknamed Margaret, name painted on the nose by the factory workers who built it. Gunn and his team took Margaret to the modification center at Eagle Farm Airfield near Brisbane. The work took 3 weeks of 16-hour days. They removed the Entire Bombardier compartment from the nose. The plexiglass panels came out. The bomb sight came out. The navigator and Bombardier positions were eliminated. In their place, gun installed a solid nose fairing with 450 caliber machine guns mounted in a tight pattern. The guns were M2 Brownings, the same model used in fighters, belt-fed with a cyclic rate of 850 rounds per minute. Gun mounts were fabricated from steel plate. Ammunition boxes were welded into position. Feed chutes routed the belts from the boxes to the guns. Blast tubes protected the fuselage from muzzle blast. Spent cartridge cases and belt links were ejected through chutes in the bottom of the nose. The entire system was controlled by a single trigger button on the pilot's control column. When he pressed the button, all 4 guns fired simultaneously. But 4 guns were not enough. Kenny wanted more firepower. Gun added 2 more guns in blisters on each side of the forward fuselage just after of the nose. These guns were fixed in position, aimed slightly inward so their fire converged with the nose guns at approximately 1,000 yards. Sheet metal fairings covered the gun barrels to reduce drag. Large blast deflector plates protected the fuselage. Skin from the muzzle blast and ejected gases. 6 guns total, but gun was not finished. He added 2 mowing guns, 1 on each side of the fuselage just forward of the cockpit. 850 caliber machine guns, all firing forward, all controlled by the pilot. The firepower was staggering. At maximum rate of fire, the 8 guns could put out 6,800 rounds per minute. That was 113 rounds per second. The weight of fire was enough to destroy any ship, any aircraft, any ground installation. Gun test flew Margaret on December 23, 1942. The aircraft was nose-heavy, exactly as predicted. It wanted to pitch down during takeoff. He had to hold back pressure on the control column to keep the nose up. Once airborne, the handling was acceptable, but not ideal. The center of gravity was too far forward. He flew to the gunnery range and fired the guns. All 850 calibers opened up simultaneously. The recoil was tremendous. The aircraft shuddered. Rivets popped out of the fuselage skin. Panels buckled from the vibration, but the guns worked. 8 streams of 50 caliber bullets converged on the target. The firepower was incredible. Gun landed and reported to Kenny. The modification worked, but needed refinement. Gun and his team spent January 1943 solving the problems. They moved the fuselage guns further aft to help the center of gravity. They added lead ballast to the tail. They reinforced rivets and structural panels. They removed the lower turret to save weight. They removed the tail guns. Those positions were useless in a low-level attack. The weight savings helped balance the aircraft. By February 1, 1943, 12 B-25 strafers were complete. They were assigned to the 90th Bomb Squadron, 3rd Bomb Group. The squadron commander was Major Edward Lana, 31 years old, experienced bomber pilot, aggressive leader. He had been flying B-25s since arriving in theater. He knew the aircraft inside and out. When he saw what gun had done, he understood immediately this was the weapon they needed. Lana spent February training his pilots on the strafer tactics. Low-level approach 250 feet above the water. High speed over 250 miles per hour. Guns open fire at 1,000 yards. Suppress all visible defenses. Release bombs at 300 yards using skip bombing technique. Pull up and climb away before the explosions. The entire attack run lasted less than 30 seconds per aircraft. The pilots practiced constantly. They flew practice runs against wrecked ships offshore. They learned to judge altitude without instruments. They learned to time their bomb releases. They learned to fire the nose guns in controlled bursts to avoid overheating. Most importantly, they learned to trust the aircraft. The strafer B-25 looked ungainly on the ground, but flew like a fighter in combat. What none of them knew was that Wright Field Engineering Command had received reports about the unauthorized modifications. Engineers at Wright Field analyzed the specifications. They calculated weight and balance. They evaluated structural loads. Their conclusion was unambiguous. The modifications were dangerous. The aircraft would be uncontrollable. The structural loads would cause catastrophic failure. They sent a message to Kenny. Ground all modified. B-25s immediately pending engineering review. Kenny received the message on February 26, 1943. He read it, crumpled it up, and threw it in the trash. His bombers were about to prove the engineers wrong. Intelligence had detected a large Japanese convoy preparing to depart Rabaul. The convoy would carry 6,900 troops to reinforce Japanese positions at Lae, New Guinea. If those troops reached Lae, the Allies would face a much stronger enemy. If the convoy could be destroyed, it would be a devastating blow to Japanese operations. Kenny called his operations officer, Brigadier General Ennis Whitehead. He told him to prepare every available aircraft for a maximum effort attack. B-17s for medium-altitude bombing, BAL. Fighters for low-level strafing, A-20s for skip bombing, and the Strafer B-25s for the killing blow. This would be their first combat test. Everything depended on Lana's squadron. The Japanese convoy departed Simpson Harbor in Rabaul on the night of February 28, 1943, 8 transport ships carrying the troops and supplies, 8 destroyers as escorts, approximately 100 fighter aircraft providing air cover. It was the largest convoy the Japanese had sent to New Guinea in months. They were confident. Their intelligence said the Allies lacked the capability to stop them. Allied intelligence was better. Radio intercepts decoded by coders in Melbourne and Washington revealed the convoy's destination and schedule. Reconnaissance aircraft spotted the convoy on March 1. It was heading south through the Bismarck Sea, making 12 knots, scheduled to arrive at Lele on March 4. Kenny had 3 days to destroy it. The attack began on the afternoon of March 2. 8 B-7s found the convoy and attacked from 15,000 feet. They claimed 2 hits. One transport appeared to be damaged. The convoy continued. The Japanese were not worried. High altitude bombing rarely worked against maneuvering ships. They pressed on toward Lae. That night, reconnaissance aircraft tracked the convoy. The ships maintained their course and dawn on March 3. They would be within range of every Allied aircraft in theater. Kenny ordered the attack for first light. Everything would hit them at once. The Japanese would not know what was happening until it was too late. March 3, 1943. 0615 hours. 90 Allied aircraft took off from bases across New Guinea. B-17s, A-20s, BAL fighters, and the Strafer. B-25s, P-38 fighters flew top cover. The formation assembled over Cape Ward Hunt and headed northwest toward the Japanese convoy. At 0945, the lead aircraft spotted the convoy. 16 ships in a tight defensive formation, destroyers on the perimeter, transports in the center. Japanese fighters circled overhead. The convoy was making maximum speed toward Lae, still 120 miles away. If they could reach the coast, they could unload under the protection of land-based anti-aircraft guns. Kenny could not let that happen. The first wave was B-7s attacking from medium altitude. The Japanese fighters rose to meet them. P-38s engaged the fighters. The B-7s released their bombs from 8,000 foot. Most missed. A few hit near the transports. One transport appeared to be on fire. The convoy continued. The second wave was BAL fighters. 13 aircraft, Royal Australian Air Force, flown by pilots who had been training for exactly this mission. They came in at 50 feet above the water, flying just above the waves, too low for the Japanese to track them effectively. The BAL fighters were armed with 420mm cannons and 6 machine guns. They opened fire at 500 yards. The effect was catastrophic for the Japanese. The cannons tore through the superstructures of the destroyers. They killed officers on the bridge. They destroyed fire control systems. They shredded anti-aircraft gun crews. The destroyers tried to return fire, but could not depress their guns low enough to hit aircraft flying at wavetop height. The BAL fighters made 2 passes and climbed away. They had done their job. The convoy's defenses were suppressed. Now came Lana's B-25s, 12 aircraft in 4 flights of 3. Lana led the first flight. They approached from the east with the morning sun behind them. Altitude 250 ft, speed 260 miles per hour. The Japanese spotted them too. Late, the Strafer B-25s were smaller and faster than B-17s. They looked like fighters until they were close enough to attack. At 1,000 YD, Lana opened fire. 850 caliber machine guns hammered. The sound was deafening even inside the pressurized cockpit. Tracers reached out toward the nearest transport ship, a 6,000-ton cargo vessel loaded with troops and supplies. The other 2 B-25s in his flight opened fire simultaneously, 24 machine guns firing at one ship. The combined firepower was devastating beyond anything the Japanese had experienced. The 50 caliber rounds tore through the transport superstructure like it was made of paper. Bridge windows exploded in showers of glass. The wheelhouse disintegrated. Gun crews died at their stations, cut down before they could return fire. Communications equipment was destroyed. Fire control systems were shredded. The transport lost steering control within the first 3 seconds of the attack. The Japanese anti-aircraft guns tried to respond. Gunners swung their weapons toward the attacking bombers, but the B-25s were too low and too fast. The guns could not depress far enough to track targets at 250-foot altitude. The few shots that were fired went high, missing completely, and then the gunners were dead, killed by the concentrated machine gun fire from 3 Strafer bombers attacking in formation. At 300 yards, Lana released his bombs, 2 500-pound bombs with 4-second delayed fuses. He pulled back on the control column and climbed away, banking hard left to clear the target area. Behind him, the bombs fell away from the aircraft, tumbled briefly, then stabilized and skipped across the water surface like flat stones on a pond. The technique was called skip bombing, and it had been perfected by Major William Ben months earlier using B-17 bombers. The bombs hit the water approximately 100 yards from the target ship. They bounced once, twice, then struck the hull at the waterline, traveling at over 200 miles per hour. The momentum carried them through the thin hull plating. The delayed fuses meant the bombs penetrated deep inside the ship before detonating. When they exploded, the blast occurred inside the hull and the cargo holds and troop compartments. The transport broke in half. The explosion blew out the bottom of the ship. Water rushed in. The forward section lifted to starboard and started to sink. The aft section rolled to port. Troops trapped below decks had no chance. The ship went down in less than 3 minutes. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers were dragged under. Total time from opening fire to climbing away was 18 seconds. The transport was doomed. Lana's wingmen attacked 2 more transports in the same formation. Captain Robert Strickland hit the second transport with the same devastating effect. His bombs penetrated the engine room. The explosion destroyed the boilers. Steam filled the compartments, killing everyone inside. The ship lost all power and started taking on water. Lieutenant Donald Mitchell attacked the 3rd transport. His machine gun fire killed the bridge crew and destroyed the steering. His bombs hit amidships, blowing a hole in the hull 20 feet across. The transport began settling by the stern. Lifeboats launched. Troops jumped into the water. The organized convoy was dissolving into chaos and 3 transports were sinking and the attack was not over. The second flight of B-25s attacked the destroyers. Major John Henry led this element. Destroyers were more dangerous than transports. They had heavier anti-aircraft armament, better fire control, more experienced crews, but they were also more lightly built. Their hulls were thinner. Their structures were more vulnerable to 50 caliber fire. Hennebrey approached the lead destroyer at an angle, coming in from the starboard quarter where most of the anti-aircraft guns could not bear. His Strafer B-25 opened fire at 1,000 yards. The 850 caliber guns concentrated on the destroyer's superstructure. They destroyed the bridge, killed the officers, wrecked the fire control equipment. The destroyer lost command and control in seconds. The bombs that followed were perfectly aimed. They skipped into the destroyer's side amidships, penetrated the thin hull, and exploded in the engineering spaces. The destroyer lost power. Dead in the water, burning. The crew abandoned ship. Another destroyer, trying to maneuver to avoid the attacking aircraft, collided with a damaged transport. The collision tore open both ships' hulls. Both vessels were lost. The third and fourth flights attacked the remaining transports. The pattern was the same: low-altitude approach at high speed, devastating machine gun fire suppressing all defenses, skipped bombing with delayed fuse bombs penetrating deep into the hulls before exploding. One after another, the Japanese transports were destroyed. By the time the last B-25 pulled away, the organized convoy had become a debris field of burning, sinking, exploding ships. The entire first attack wave, from when the bow fighters opened fire at 0953 to when the last B-25 pulled away at 1007, lasted 14 minutes. In that time, the Allies sank or mortally damaged 12 ships. The Japanese lost 3 transports and 2 destroyers outright in those first 14 minutes. 4 more transports were burning and would sink within hours. 2 more destroyers were severely damaged and limping back toward Rabble. The remaining ships scattered, trying to reach the coast before the next attack wave arrived. Lana reformed his squadron and flew back to base. They landed at Port Moresby at 11:30. The ground crews were waiting. They counted the aircraft. All 12 strafers returned. Minor damage on 3 aircraft, no casualties. Lana climbed out of his cockpit and walked to the operations tent. He reported to Whitehead. The attack worked exactly as planned. The Strafer B-25s performed perfectly. What Lana and Kenny did not know was that Japanese submarine I-26 was in the area rescuing survivors. The submarine captain filed a report describing the attack. He called it the most devastating aerial assault he had ever witnessed. American bombers attacking at wavetop height with overwhelming firepower. Ships had no chance to defend themselves. The attack was over before crews could organize effective resistance. Entire transports were destroyed in seconds. The submarine captain recommended that future convoys avoid daylight movement in range of American aircraft. The risk was too great. Follow-up attacks continued on March 4. A-20s and bow fighters attacked survivors in the water and rescue ships trying to pick them up. This was controversial then and remains controversial now. The attacking pilots and commanders defended the decision. Any Japanese soldier who reached shore would join enemy forces. The battle was not over until the enemy could no longer fight. The attacks continued. PT boats from the U.S. Navy joined the cleanup operations. They found scattered groups of survivors and engaged them. A few hundred Japanese soldiers reached the coast and eventually made it to Lae. Most did not. Of the 6,900 troops that left Rabble, approximately 1,200 reached Lae. Another 2,700 were rescued by destroyers and submarines and returned to Rabble. The rest, approximately 3,000 men, were killed. Japanese losses were catastrophic. 8 transports sunk. 4 destroyers sunk, 2 destroyers damaged, multiple aircraft shot down. 3,000 soldiers and sailors dead. The convoy was annihilated. Japan never again attempted to send a large convoy through waters controlled by Allied aircraft. American losses were minimal. 13 air crew killed, 12 wounded, 3 P-38s and 1 B-17 shot down in combat, 1 B-25 and 1 bow fighter crashed in accidents. For the Allies, it was a stunning victory. For the Japanese, it was a disaster that fundamentally changed their strategy in the Southwest Pacific. But none of that would have been possible without PP guns' unauthorized modifications. The Strafer B-25s were the decisive weapon. They delivered the killing blows that sank the convoy. Without them, the attack would have been less effective. Ships would have escaped. Troops would have reached Leh. The battle would have been different. Major General Hap Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, was in Washington when reports of the Battle of Bismarck arrived. He read them with interest. The results were impressive, but he had questions about the modified B-25s. His engineering staff at Wright Field had filed reports saying those modifications were dangerous and unauthorized. Now those same aircraft had just won a major victory. Arnold wanted answers. He called Kenney to Washington for a conference in late March 1943. Kenney flew back to the United States, bringing complete data on the Strafer modifications. He met with Arnold and a team of engineers from Wright Field. The engineers presented their analysis. The modifications violated multiple regulations. The center of gravity was outside acceptable limits. The structural loads exceeded design specifications. The aircraft should be grounded immediately. Kenney listened to them present their case for 20 minutes. Then he told them that the modified B-25s had just helped sink 8 transports and 4 destroyers in the most decisive air victory of the Pacific War. 12 Strafer B-25s attacked at minimum altitude against heavy defenses. All 12 returned safely. The modifications worked. The pilots loved them. The results spoke for themselves. The engineers argued that the modifications were still outside specifications. Kenney replied that he did not care about specifications. He cared about winning the war. His pilots were killing Japanese with those modifications. If Wright Field wanted to help, they could figure out how to make the modifications official and incorporate them into production aircraft. If they did not want to help, they could get out of his way. Arnold sided with Kenney. The results were undeniable. He directed North American Aviation, the manufacturer of the B-25, to work with Gunn to incorporate the Strafer modifications into production. He ordered Wright Field to provide engineering support instead of obstacles. The modifications would become official. Gunn traveled to North American Aviation's plant in California. In April 1943, he worked with the engineering team for 3 weeks, explaining how the field modifications were done. The North American engineers were highly impressed. They refined Gunn's gun design, adding 6.50 caliber machine guns instead of 4 in the nose, enhancing structural reinforcements, and standardizing the installation. By June 1943, North American was producing B-25 Strafers straight from the factory. The factory-built Strafers became the B-25G and later the B-25H. The G model added a 75mm cannon in the nose alongside the machine guns. The H model featured 14.50 caliber machine guns plus the cannon. The final variant, the B-25J, could be configured either as a Strafer with 18 machine guns or as a standard bomber with a glazed nose. Nearly 10,000 B-25s were produced during the war, with thousands of them being Strafers based on Gunn's original design. The Strafer B-25s continued to wreak havoc on Japanese forces throughout the Pacific, destroying shipping, leveling airfields, and annihilating ground positions. At WWII in August 1943, Strafer B-25s destroyed 174 Japanese aircraft on the ground in a single raid at Hansa Bay. In March 1944, they obliterated 400 more aircraft. The Japanese never regained air superiority in New Guinea, yet official records fail to mention Papigun by name. North American Aviation's documents credited the Strafer design to company engineers, while Army Air Forces reports attributed the modifications to 5th Air Force innovation. Gunn's name appears only in maintenance logs and field reports, not in official histories. He received no medal, no commendation, no recognition beyond the pilots and mechanics who knew what he had accomplished. Edward Lana did not survive the war. On April 30, 1943, less than 2 months after leading the attack at the Bismarck, Lana was landing at Dobodura Airfield after a mission. He executed his signature maneuver, diving toward the runway, skimming low over the field, then pulling up sharply into a climbing turn. But this time, his aircraft was heavily loaded with fuel, passengers, cargo, and ammunition. When he pulled up, the plane stalled, entered a flat spin, and crashed. Lana and everyone aboard perished. He left behind a wife and 2 daughters at the age of 31. Captain John Henbury took command of the 90th Squadron, continuing Lana's aggressive tactics and becoming one of the most successful strafer pilots in the Pacific. He flew dozens of missions, destroyed numerous Japanese targets, and trained new pilots in the techniques Lana had pioneered. The 90th Squadron, nicknamed the Jolly Rogers, maintained the highest kill ratio of any B-25 unit in the theater. George Kenney remained commander of the Far East Air Forces until the war's end, leading campaigns across New Guinea, the Philippines, and ultimately Japan. He pioneered airlift operations, paratrooper assaults, and coordinated air-ground operations, later authoring 3 books on the Pacific Air Campaign, including the Saga of Pappy Gun in 1959, a tribute to the man Kenney called one of aviation's great pioneers. Pappy Gun survived the war barely, flying hundreds of combat missions, wounded 9 times, and earning 2 Distinguished Flying Crosses, a Silver Star, a Legion of Merit, an Air Medal, and 9 Purple Hearts. He was promoted first to lieutenant colonel, then to colonel. When the Philippines were liberated in 1945, he was reunited with his family, who had survived 3 years of internment at the University of Santo Tomas in Manila, emaciated and traumatized but alive. Gunn retired from the Army Air Forces in June 1948 due to war-related disabilities, returning to the Philippines to restart Philippine Airlines, the company he had founded before the war. He flew charter flights across the Pacific, rebuilt the airline industry, and lived quietly, never seeking recognition for his wartime innovations, humbly claiming he was just a mechanic who fixed airplanes. On October 11, 1957, Gunn was flying a charter in a Beechcraft Model 18 over the Philippines when a storm developed faster than forecast. The aircraft encountered severe turbulence and heavy rain. Gunn attempted to climb above the weather but could not gain altitude fast enough. The plane crashed into a mountainside, killing Gunn and all aboard at age 57. He is buried at Barrancas National Cemetery at Naval Air Station, Pensacola, Florida, with his grave marker noting his rank as Colonel, United States Army Air Forces, dates of birth October 18, 1899, and death October 11, 1957. The marker acknowledges his World War II service but does not mention that he transformed how American bombers fought in the Pacific, the strafer modifications that destroyed thousands of Japanese targets and saved hundreds of American lives, or the Battle of Bismarck Sea. It does not mention that his unauthorized innovations, executed without approval or recognition, fundamentally shifted the balance of power in the Southwest Pacific. Philippine Airlines still exists, continuing the company Gunn founded in 1941, more than 80 years later. It is among the oldest commercial airlines in Asia, surviving World War II and operating into the modern era, flying across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, connecting the Philippines to the world. Few passengers know that the airline's founder was an American colonel who waged a personal war against the Japanese who had imprisoned his family, or that before building an airline, he built strafer bombers that changed naval warfare. The B-25 strafer concept spread beyond the 5th Air Force. By late 1943, strafer conversions were standard throughout the Pacific theater. The 7th Air Force in the Central Pacific adopted them, the 13th Air Force in the Solomon Islands employed them, and Marine Corps PBJ squadrons flying Navy-designated B-25s used strafer configurations for ground attack missions. The idea even reached Europe, where the 12th Air Force modified B-25s for ground attacks in Italy and southern France, although these European modifications were less extensive than those in the Pacific. North American aviation produced thousands of factory-built strafer B-25s based on Gunn's original field modifications. The B-25G introduced a 75mm M4 cannon in the nose, the largest caliber ever mounted in an American bomber, requiring complex structural reinforcement. The cannon could destroy ships with a single hit but had a slow rate of fire and formidable recoil, earning it a reputation as both effective and terrifying. The B-25H refined the concept further, with 14 forward-firing .50 caliber machine guns plus the 75mm cannon, some variants adding additional guns in tail and waist positions, producing immense firepower. At maximum rate, all 14 guns fired simultaneously could produce over 10,000 rounds per minute, so pilots had to fire in controlled bursts to avoid overheating barrels or depleting ammunition too quickly. The final production model, the B-25J, could be configured as a glass-nosed conventional medium bomber or a solid-nosed strafer carrying up to 18.50 caliber machine guns. Nearly 5,000 J models were built in both configurations, making the B-25 the most successful medium bomber of World War II. Total production exceeded 9,800 aircraft, serving in every theater, flying more combat missions than any other American twin-engine bomber, destroying more enemy targets, and experiencing lower loss rates than comparable aircraft. Strafer versions, directly descended from Gunn's unauthorized modifications, accounted for thousands of enemy ships, aircraft, vehicles, and installations destroyed, making their impact on the Pacific War immeasurable. B-25 strafers are displayed in military museums across the United States, often highlighting their role in the Pacific War, the Battle of Bismarck Sea, skip bombing, and low-level attack tactics. Very few acknowledge Pappy Gunn, whose name remains largely forgotten outside aviation history and World War II research circles. This illustrates how innovation in war often occurs not through official channels, engineering committees, or headquarters meetings, but through mechanics and pilots who solve urgent problems without waiting for permission, scavenging parts from wrecked planes, breaking rules when lives are at stake, and waging personal wars against enemies who have taken everything. The Battle of Bismarck Sea marked a turning point in the New Guinea campaign, proving that Allied air power could halt Japanese reinforcement convoys, demonstrating the effectiveness of coordinated low-level attacks, and validating innovations developed in the field by men who did not wait for headquarters approval. The battle lasted 3 days, but the decisive attack lasted 14 minutes. In those 14 minutes, 12 modified bombers destroyed a convoy and changed the course of the Pacific War. It all began with a middle-aged captain in grease-stained coveralls, installing scavenged machine guns in a bomber nose, telling a general that the only way to win was to break the rules and hit the enemy harder than they could hit back.